What would you do if the people closest to you weren't who they seemed? The Browns were an ordinary family, or so they thought, until one devastating tragedy unraveled a web of lies, secrets, and betrayals buried deep within their history. Tonight, a dinner meant to bring them together will shatter their lives forever. Stay with us as we uncover the truth, piece by piece. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sky over Charleston, South Carolina, was painted in fiery streaks of orange and crimson as the Browns prepared for their long-anticipated family dinner. Martha Brown, the 76-year-old matriarch, had insisted on the gathering, claiming it was time for her children to reconcile their differences. But beneath Martha's warm exterior lay a growing unease, a gnawing fear that someone close to her might not have her best interests at heart. The first to arrive was Karen, Martha's eldest daughter, impeccably dressed in a navy blue blazer. Her polished demeanor was as sharp as ever, though it failed to mask the tension in her eyes. Following closely was Paul, the youngest, whose rugged jeans and worn leather jacket reflected his estranged relationship with the family's wealth. Finally came Robert, the middle child and the supposed success story of the Browns. His expensive car and tailored suit spoke of his financial success, but his curt demeanor hinted at deeper troubles. As the family gathered in the elegant dining room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. The ornate chandelier above cast fragmented light on the table, its glow failing to thaw the chill between them. Martha, seated at the head, tapped her fork against her glass to quiet the murmurs. "I brought you all here tonight for a reason," she began, her voice steady but firm. "There are things we need to talk about. Truths that can no longer stay buried." Karen exchanged a wary glance with Robert, while Paul crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "Is this about the will again?" Karen finally asked, her tone clipped. Martha shook her head. "This is bigger than that." Before she could elaborate, the room plunged into chaos. A loud crash echoed from the backyard, followed by frantic screams. Startled, the family rushed to the window, their faces pressed against the glass. What they saw left them frozen in disbelief. A lion, its golden mane glinting in the moonlight, prowled across the lawn. "Is this some kind of joke?" Paul muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. But the lion was no illusion. It had escaped from a nearby traveling circus, and its presence turned the Browns' estate into a scene of surreal danger. As the chaos unfolded outside, inside the house, tensions escalated. Karen accused Paul of orchestrating the incident to distract from his failures. "You're always trying to derail everything important," she snapped. Paul retorted, his voice rising. "And you're always looking for someone to blame, Karen. Maybe you should take a good look in the mirror." Robert, the self-proclaimed peacemaker, attempted to defuse the situation, but his intervention only drew suspicion. "Why are you so quick to defend him, Robert?" Karen demanded. Martha's voice cut through the bickering. "Enough!" She slammed her hand on the table, silencing her children. "This family is falling apart, and you're all too blind to see it." The dinner ended abruptly, with each sibling retreating to their corners of the house, leaving Martha alone at the table. She stared into her untouched glass of wine, her mind replaying the events of the evening. When the police arrived to secure the lion, one officer noticed Martha's unease. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked gently. Martha hesitated, then replied, "I don't think so." The officer's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Before Martha could answer, a sharp pain shot through her chest, and she collapsed to the floor. Hours later, as the family gathered in the hospital waiting room, an uneasy silence fell over them. Karen clutched her purse tightly, Robert stared at the floor, and Paul paced the room. "What was she trying to tell us?" Karen finally asked, breaking the silence. Paul stopped pacing and faced her. "Maybe she knows something we don't." Before Karen could respond, the doctor entered the room, his expression grave. "Your mother's stable for now, but she mentioned something unusual before losing consciousness," he said. "What did she say?" Robert asked, his voice strained. The doctor hesitated. "She said, it's all starting again. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unanswered questions. Karen, Robert, and Paul exchanged uneasy glances, each silently wondering what their mother had meant. Later that night, Karen returned to the family home, her mind racing. She found herself drawn to the attic, where Martha kept her most personal belongings. Among the dusty trunks and faded photographs, Karen uncovered a small wooden box. Inside was a bundle of letters yellowed with age. The first letter, addressed to Martha, read, "If you think you can keep this secret forever, you're wrong. They will come for you, and when they do, everything you've worked for will crumble." Karen's hands trembled as she read the cryptic words. What secret was her mother hiding? And who had written the letter? Before she could process the discovery, a floorboard creaked behind her. Spinning around, she came face to face with Paul. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice low. "I could ask you the same thing," Karen shot back. Paul's gaze fell to the letter in her hand. "So, you found them," he said quietly. "Found what?" Karen demanded. Paul sighed. "Mom's been hiding those letters for years, but I've seen them before." Karen's heart raced. "You knew about this? And you didn't say anything?" "I didn't think it mattered anymore," Paul admitted. "But maybe I was wrong." Karen stared at him, her mind spinning with questions. "Who sent these letters, Paul?" "I don't know," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But whoever it was, they're not done with us yet." As the weight of his words sank in, a chill ran down Karen's spine. The mystery was far from over, and the truth, whatever it was, threatened to destroy them all. The morning sun cast an eerie stillness over the Brown estate, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Karen hadn't slept. The letter she found in the attic replayed in her mind, every word etched like a warning. She clutched the fragile paper, now folded neatly in her pocket, and stared at the coffee mug in her hands. Across the table, Paul sat silently, his own thoughts heavy. "You said you've seen these letters before," Karen said finally, her voice breaking the quiet. Paul nodded but didn't meet her eyes. "Years ago, I was maybe 20. I came across one of them in Mom's study. I thought it was some old drama she'd moved past." Karen leaned forward. "Drama? Paul, this isn't just drama. Someone's been threatening her, and she's been hiding it for years. Why would she do that?" Before Paul could answer, Robert walked into the kitchen, his tie crooked, his phone in hand. "Are we really doing this now?" he asked, his tone sharp. Karen shot him a glare. "Where were you last night after we left the hospital?" "You disappeared," Robert scoffed. "I had a call to take. Not that it's any of your business." "Call or an excuse to avoid facing what's happening," Karen snapped. Paul slammed his hand on the table, silencing them both. "Enough. This isn't about you two. It's about Mom. And whatever she's been hiding, it's coming back to haunt us." Robert arched a brow. "Haunt us? Really, Paul? You sound paranoid." Karen pulled the letter from her pocket and slid it across the table. "Read this and tell me I'm paranoid." Robert picked up the letter, his expression shifting as he read. For once, he was silent. Finally, he set it down. "Where did you find this?" "The attic," Karen said. "It was in a box with a bunch of other letters." "Paul's seen them before." Robert turned to Paul. "And you didn't think it was worth mentioning?" "I didn't know they were still around," Paul shot back. "And honestly, I figured it was one of your screw-ups causing trouble." Robert's face darkened. "Watch it, Paul." Karen stood, her patience wearing thin. "Both of you, stop. Can we focus on what matters? Who sent these letters? And why?" The three siblings spent the morning sorting through the remaining letters. Most were cryptic, with vague threats and warnings. One, dated 20 years earlier, mentioned a name none of them recognized: Elizabeth Radford. "Who's Elizabeth Radford?" Karen wondered aloud. Paul frowned. "Never heard of her." He asked Robert. Robert shook his head. "No. But if Mom kept these, she must know who it is." Karen hesitated. "Do you think this has something to do with Dad?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for years. Their father's death had always been shrouded in quiet mystery. Officially, it was a heart attack, but there had always been whispers, things left unsaid. Only one way to find out, Paul said, standing. We ask Mom. But when they arrived at the hospital, Martha was asleep, her frail form barely moving under the thin blanket. A nurse informed them that she had been sedated after a restless night. Karen sighed. We'll have to wait. Back at the house, Karen decided to dig deeper into the attic. Paul joined her while Robert retreated to his room, muttering about more important things to handle. As they sifted through dusty boxes and forgotten keepsakes, Karen found an old photo album. She flipped through it slowly, her brow furrowing. Paul, look at this. He leaned over. The photos showed their parents at a much younger age, smiling at parties, holding hands in gardens. But as Karen turned the pages, the tone shifted. A woman began appearing in the background, always just far enough away to seem incidental, but her presence was consistent. Who is that? Karen asked, pointing to the woman. Paul shrugged. No idea. But she's in almost every photo from that year. Karen scanned the margins of the album. In one photo, the name Liz was scrawled faintly on the back. Elizabeth Radford? Karen whispered. Paul's eyes widened. We need to find out who she is. The next morning, Karen sat at her laptop, determined to uncover the truth. She scoured online records, social media, and archives. Finally, she found something. An obituary for an Elizabeth Radford from Charleston. She had died nearly 20 years ago, the same year their father passed. The obituary mentioned no family but noted that she had worked as a legal secretary for the firm that handled their father's estate. Karen's heart raced as she printed the page. She couldn't shake the feeling that this woman's connection to their family was far more than coincidental. Downstairs, Paul and Robert were arguing again. You're selling us out, Robert, Paul shouted. I'm trying to keep this family afloat, Robert snapped back. Unlike you, who just runs away every time things get hard. Karen stormed in, slamming the obituary onto the table. Enough! Look at this. Paul and Robert leaned over the paper. Elizabeth Radford, Karen said. She worked for the law firm that handled Dad's estate. She died the same year he did. Robert frowned. So, what does that prove? Karen glared at him. Don't you find it odd? She's mentioned in those letters, and now this? There's a connection. We just have to figure out what it is. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. She wandered the house, her thoughts racing. In the study, she noticed an old locked drawer in their father's desk. The key, she remembered, was in Martha's jewelry box. Quietly, she retrieved the key and unlocked the drawer. Inside, she found more letters, but these were addressed to their father. One stood out. Henry, if you think you can erase me from your life, you're mistaken. I know everything, and I won't stay silent. Elizabeth. Karen's breath caught in her throat. What did Elizabeth know? The following morning, Karen shared the letter with Paul and Robert. Paul stared at it, his face pale. She was threatening Dad. But why? Karen asked. Robert's expression darkened. What if Dad wasn't the man we thought he was? Karen shook her head. No, there has to be more to this. As the siblings debated, the doorbell rang. Karen answered it, finding a man in his late 40s standing on the porch. Can I help you? She asked. The man held out a worn envelope. I think you're looking for me. My name's Daniel Radford. Elizabeth was my mother. The siblings froze. The air in the room grew heavy as Daniel Radford stepped into the brown estate, his worn boots brushing against the pristine rug. Karen led him into the living room, her siblings trailing behind with wide eyes and guarded expressions. The name Radford had haunted their morning, and now, standing before them, was the flesh and blood connection to the mysterious Elizabeth. Daniel's face was lined with age, though his eyes held a sharpness that suggested he'd spent years chasing truths. He clutched the envelope tightly in his hand, his knuckles pale against the crumpled paper. You said you were looking for me? Karen began, her voice tentative. Why? Daniel took a moment before responding. Because your family has answers I've been searching for my entire life. Robert crossed his arms, his tone skeptical. Answers to what? To why your father destroyed mine, Daniel said bluntly. The room fell into a stunned silence. the weight of Daniel's accusation hanging heavily between them. Karen gestured for him to sit, and he lowered himself onto the edge of the couch. Paul leaned against the doorway, his arms folded, while Robert stood stiffly near the fireplace, his face unreadable. Karen sat across from Daniel, her hands clasped together to steady herself. "Start from the beginning," she said. Daniel glanced around the room, taking in the ornate furnishings and family portraits. "Your father, Henry Brown, wasn't just a businessman. He had other dealings. My mother, Elizabeth, worked for him at his firm. At first, it was professional. She handled his legal affairs, his estate planning, things like that. But over time, it became personal." Karen frowned. "Personal how?" Daniel hesitated. "They had an affair." Paul's eyes widened, and Robert scoffed. "That's ridiculous," Robert said. "Our father was a lot of things. But he wasn't a cheater." Daniel's gaze hardened. "You think I came here to lie? My mother kept everything. Letters, documents, even a photograph of the two of them together. She told me about your father before she died." Karen's mind reeled as she remembered the photograph in the attic. The mysterious woman always lingering in the background. "She's in the photo album," Karen murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "What photo album?" Robert demanded. Karen ignored him and turned back to Daniel. "If this is true, why would she keep quiet? Why wouldn't she confront him?" "She tried," Daniel said, "but your father threatened her. He said if she told anyone, he'd ruin her life. And he did. She lost her job, her reputation, everything. He even made sure she couldn't find work in Charleston again." Paul stepped forward, his voice low. "You're saying Dad destroyed her career?" Daniel nodded. "And more. She died broke, humiliated, and alone. All because of your father." Karen's hands trembled as she absorbed Daniel's story. "Why now? Why come to us after all these years?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Because my mother left me something before she died. Something she said would prove everything. I want to know the truth. Not just for her, but for me." He slid the envelope across the coffee table. Karen hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a faded letter written in their father's handwriting. "Elizabeth, you need to understand. If you go through with this, there will be consequences. Think of your son. Think of what you'll lose. This is your final warning. Henry." Karen's stomach churned as she read the words aloud. Paul ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. Robert snatched the letter from her hands, his face twisting in disbelief. "This doesn't prove anything," Robert said. "It's just words." "It proves enough," Daniel said coldly. "Your father threatened my mother to keep her silent. And for what? What was he so desperate to hide?" The siblings sat in stunned silence after Daniel's revelation. The cracks in their family's perfect facade had been deepening for years, but now it felt like the entire foundation was crumbling. Karen finally broke the silence. "We need to find out what happened between Dad and Elizabeth," she said. "If there's more to this story, we have to know." Robert scoffed. "What good will it do? Digging into the past won't change anything." Karen shot him a sharp look. "This isn't just about us, Robert. If Dad did what Daniel says, don't you think we owe him the truth?" Paul nodded. "She's right. We can't ignore this." Reluctantly, Robert relented. "Fine, but don't expect me to believe every word this guy says." The next day, Karen and Paul visited the law firm where their father had worked decades earlier. The building was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the weight of the secrets they were chasing. A receptionist directed them to the archives, where an elderly clerk helped them search for records related to Elizabeth Radford. After hours of digging, they found a file labeled with her name. Inside were documents detailing a legal dispute between Elizabeth and Henry Brown. The papers revealed that Elizabeth had attempted to sue Henry for wrongful termination, but the case had been quietly dismissed. Attached was a handwritten note. "Settle this immediately. No publicity. No leaks." The note was signed by their father. Back at the estate, Karen and Paul presented their findings to Robert and Daniel. "So, Dad paid her off," Robert said, his tone dismissive. "Big deal. That doesn't mean anything." It means he had something to hide, Paul argued, and he was willing to go to great lengths to keep it buried. Karen turned to Daniel. What else do you know? Did your mother ever tell you what she was suing him for? Daniel hesitated. She said it was about money at first, but later, she told me it was about something bigger. Something that could ruin him. What was it? Karen pressed. I don't know, Daniel admitted. She never told me, but she left me a key. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished key. What does it open? Paul asked. Daniel shook his head. I don't know, but I think it's connected to your family. Karen's eyes widened as she remembered the locked drawer in their father's desk. I think I know where it goes. The group gathered in the study, where Karen unlocked the drawer with the key. Inside, they found a small leather journal. Karen opened it carefully, her hands trembling. The first page bore her father's handwriting. If you're reading this, then the past has finally caught up to me. What I did was unforgivable, but I had no choice. I had to protect the family. I had to protect them from her. Karen's heart raced as she read the words aloud. Who's her? Paul asked, his voice hushed. I think it's Elizabeth, Karen said. But why would he need to protect us from her? Daniel stared at the journal, his jaw clenched. Whatever it is, my mother paid the price for it. And now, so will your family. The journal sat between them like a loaded weapon, its contents capable of shattering what little unity the Brown family had left. Karen clutched it tightly, her knuckles white against the worn leather. Daniel's piercing gaze remained fixed on her, as if daring her to continue. Read more, Paul urged, leaning forward from his chair. Karen hesitated, glancing at Robert, whose stiff posture betrayed his discomfort. This is our father's private writing, she said. We don't know what's in here. It could be the truth, Daniel interrupted, his tone sharp. Or are you afraid of what you'll find? Karen swallowed hard and flipped to the next page. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, as if written in desperation. I didn't want to hurt her. I begged her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. She knew too much. Elizabeth always knew too much. Karen froze mid-sentence. What did she know? Paul whispered, his voice thick with unease. Karen continued reading aloud, though her voice trembled. She found the records, the payments. If they came to light, it would destroy everything, our reputation, our future. She swore she'd expose us unless I gave her what she wanted. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't let it go. I had no choice but to cut her off for good. The room fell silent. The meaning behind their father's words loomed over them like a dark shadow. What records? Paul asked. What payments? Daniel's expression darkened. It sounds like your father was hiding more than just an affair. He was paying her off for something. Karen's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of the revelations. The journal painted a picture of their father as a man consumed by secrets, willing to go to extreme lengths to protect himself. But it also raised more questions than it answered. Where would these records be? Karen asked, looking to Daniel. How should I know? Daniel replied, This is your house, your family. If they exist, they're somewhere here. Paul stood abruptly. Then we find them. If Dad kept this journal, he must have kept the records somewhere too. Robert, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. This is a waste of time. Dad's gone. Whatever he did or didn't do, it's in the past. Digging it up now won't change anything. Karen turned to him, her voice steady but firm. It changes everything, Robert. If Dad hurt Elizabeth, if he destroyed her life, we need to know why. We owe it to her and to Daniel. Robert scoffed. You don't owe him anything. He shows up out of nowhere with his sob story, and suddenly we're supposed to tear our family apart over it. Daniel stepped forward, his fists clenched. My mother's life was torn apart because of your family. Don't you dare act like this isn't your problem. Before Robert could respond, Karen stepped between them. Enough! We're not getting anywhere by fighting. The siblings spent the next several hours combing through the house, searching for any trace of the elusive records mentioned in the journal. Karen returned to the attic, where she sifted through old trunks and boxes, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. In the far corner of the attic, she found a battered suitcase that had belonged to their father. Inside, among stacks of faded documents, she discovered a bundle of files tied together with twine. Her breath caught as she untied them and began to read. The records detailed a series of payments made from their father's business account to Elizabeth Radford over the course of several years. The amounts were substantial enough to raise questions, but it was a single memo, buried within the stack, that sent a chill down Karen's spine. Payment for silence regarding incident, 1983. Final. Karen stared at the words, her mind spinning. Incident, 1983. What could it mean? She needed answers. Karen rushed downstairs to the living room, where Paul, Robert, and Daniel were still searching. I found something, she announced, holding up the documents. Paul took the stack and flipped through it quickly, his expression growing darker with each page. These payments, Dad was paying her off for years. Robert snatched the memo from Karen's hand, his face paling as he read it. Incident, 1983? What does that mean? That's what we need to figure out, Karen said. Daniel, who had been standing silently, stepped closer. 1983. That was the year my mother lost everything. The year she lost her job, her house, her dignity. Karen frowned. Do you think the incident has something to do with what happened to her? I don't think, Daniel said. I know. Determined to uncover the truth, the siblings and Daniel turned their focus to the year 1983. Karen remembered that their father had kept a detailed calendar in his study, chronicling every meeting and event. If there was a clue, it would be there. After rummaging through the old desk drawers, they found the 1983 calendar. Most of the entries were mundane business meetings, charity events, family gatherings. But one date stood out. April 12th, written in bold letters were the words, Radford meeting urgent. What happened on April 12th? Paul wondered aloud. I don't know, Karen admitted. But it must have been important. Daniel's jaw tightened. That's the day everything fell apart for my mother. Karen suggested they visit the law firm where Elizabeth had worked. Perhaps the firm's records could shed light on what had transpired. Daniel agreed to accompany her, while Paul and Robert stayed behind to continue searching the house. At the firm, an older secretary named Mrs. Whitaker greeted them. She had worked there for decades and remembered both Elizabeth and Henry. Elizabeth was a bright woman, Mrs. Whitaker said wistfully. She had a good head on her shoulders. But things got complicated. What do you mean? Karen asked. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated. There were rumors, tensions between her and your father. I don't know the details, but whatever it was, it didn't end well. Karen pressed further. Do you have any records from 1983? Specifically, anything about a meeting between Elizabeth and my father? Mrs. Whitaker frowned. Most of the records from that year were destroyed in a fire. But there's one place you might look. She directed them to the firm's off-site storage facility, where older, undigitized files were kept. At the storage facility, Karen and Daniel combed through boxes of dusty files, searching for anything connected to their father or Elizabeth. Hours passed with little success, until Karen stumbled upon a folder marked Confidential. H. Brown. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Memorandum, April 12, 1983. Subject, termination of Elizabeth Radford. Reason, violation of non-disclosure agreement. Compromised client confidentiality. Immediate action required. Karen's heart sank as she read the words. He fired her because she knew something. Daniel's face darkened. Not just something, she knew everything. When they returned to the Brown estate, the weight of the discovery pressed heavily on Karen's shoulders. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something monumental, something that would change everything they thought they knew about their father. But as she stepped through the front door, she was met with an ominous sight. Paul and Robert standing over the shattered remnants of the journal, their faces pale with shock. What happened? Karen demanded. Paul held up a torn piece of paper from the journal, his voice trembling. We found the final entry. Karen took the fragment and read the scrawled words. If she reveals the truth, it will destroy us all. I have to stop her, no matter the cost." The room fell silent as the gravity of their father's words sank in. What truth had Elizabeth threatened to reveal? And how far had their father gone to stop her? The Browns stood frozen in the study, their father's ominous words hanging over them like a storm cloud. Karen gripped the fragment of the journal tightly, her mind racing with questions. Paul paced the room, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief, while Robert remained unusually quiet, his face pale. Daniel, standing near the doorway, clenched his fists as he stared at the shattered remnants of the journal on the floor. Karen broke the silence. "We need to figure out what this truth is. Whatever Dad was hiding, it's the key to everything. Elizabeth, the payments, and why he felt he had to stop her." Paul stopped pacing and turned to Karen. "But how? The journal is gone. The files we found only raise more questions, and Mom's still in the hospital. What else is there?" Karen glanced at Daniel, her brow furrowed. "You said your mother kept everything. Letters, documents. Did she ever leave you anything else? Something that might point us in the right direction?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "She had a safety deposit box at a local bank. I've never opened it because I didn't have the key." Paul frowned. "Then how do you know it's connected to this?" "Because she told me," Daniel replied. "Before she died, she said, 'Everything you need to know is in the box.'" Karen's heart raced. "We need to get into that box. Do you know which bank it's at?" Daniel nodded. "It's at the Charleston Federal Savings Bank." The next morning, Karen and Daniel drove to the bank while Paul and Robert stayed behind to continue combing through their father's belongings. The bank was a grand old building with marble columns and a quiet, imposing air. Daniel approached the counter and explained his situation to the manager, a woman named Mrs. Ellis, who regarded him with a mix of curiosity and sympathy. "I can give you access to the box if you can provide proof of your relationship with Ms. Radford," Mrs. Ellis said. Daniel nodded and handed her a worn envelope containing his mother's death certificate and a notarized letter she had written years ago, naming him as her sole heir. After reviewing the documents, Mrs. Ellis nodded. "Follow me." She led them to a secure vault in the back of the building. Karen's pulse quickened as the heavy door creaked open, revealing rows of metal boxes. Mrs. Ellis unlocked box 348 and stepped aside. Daniel reached in and pulled out a single manila folder. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a stack of documents and a small cassette tape. Back at the Brown estate, Karen, Daniel, Paul, and Robert gathered in the living room. The tension in the air was palpable as Daniel laid the contents of the folder on the coffee table. Karen picked up the top document, a letter written by Elizabeth. Her voice shook as she read aloud. "Henry, I've kept your secret long enough. I can't live with the guilt anymore. If you don't come clean, I will. This isn't just about me or you. It's about the lives you've ruined and the people you've hurt. The truth has to come out no matter the cost." "Elizabeth," Paul ran a hand through his hair. "What secret? What guilt?" Karen shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever it is," she was ready to expose him. Daniel picked up the cassette tape, his jaw tight. This might have the answers. Robert crossed his arms, his voice dripping with skepticism. "And what if it's just more accusations? We don't even know what's on it." "We're about to find out," Karen said. She retrieved an old tape player from the study, placed the cassette inside, and pressed play. The tape crackled to life, and Elizabeth's voice filled the room. "If you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. I've recorded this because I know Henry will stop at nothing to silence me, and I need the truth to survive beyond me. For years, Henry and I worked together at the firm. At first, I admired him, his ambition, his charm. But as I got closer to him, I saw another side. He was ruthless, willing to do anything to protect his image and his wealth. One night, I discovered something I wasn't supposed to see. Financial records, evidence of a massive embezzlement scheme Henry had orchestrated. He was stealing from his clients, funneling money into offshore accounts. When I confronted him, he begged me to stay quiet. He said he'd make it worth my while. I refused. I told him I was going to the authorities. That's when he threatened me. He said if I didn't back off, he'd destroy me. And he did. He had me fired, blacklisted, and humiliated. But I kept the records, proof of everything he did. They're hidden somewhere, he'll never find them. And if you're hearing this, it's up to you to make sure the truth comes out. The tape ended with a click, leaving the room in stunned silence. Karen stared at the player, her mind racing. Dad was embezzling? That's what this is all about. Robert shook his head, his face pale. No, can't be. Dad wasn't a criminal. Then explain this, Daniel snapped, holding up the documents from the folder. These are bank statements showing transactions to offshore accounts. Exactly what my mother described. Paul sank into a chair, his head in his hands. This is why he paid her off. To keep her quiet. But she didn't stop, did she? That's why he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Karen's stomach turned as she realized the implication. He didn't just silence her professionally. He destroyed her. And when that wasn't enough, he made sure she'd never expose him. Later that night, Karen couldn't sleep. She wandered the house, her mind replaying the events of the day. She ended up in the study, where she stared at the old family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Her father's stern face seemed to mock her, as if daring her to uncover more. As her gaze drifted to the corner of the room, something caught her eye, a faint crack in the wooden paneling near the bookshelf. Curious, she approached it and ran her fingers along the edge. The panel shifted slightly under her touch. With a burst of adrenaline, she pushed the panel aside, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small safe. Karen's heart raced as she retrieved the key from her father's desk drawer and unlocked the safe. Inside were stacks of papers and a photograph of Elizabeth, standing arm in arm with Henry, her face etched with pain. Among the papers was a final note from their father. To my children, if you found this, then the past has caught up with me. Everything I did to protect our family. But some sins can't be buried forever. I only hope you can forgive me. Karen sat on the floor, staring at the contents of the safe. The truth was worse than she had imagined. Their father wasn't the man they thought he was. And now it was up to them to decide what to do with his legacy. As dawn broke, Karen knew one thing for certain. The Browns would never be the same. The discovery of the safe's contents lingered in the house like a ghost. Karen remained in the study long after the sun rose, the photograph of Elizabeth and her father clutched in her trembling hands. The once pristine image of Henry Brown had now been irrevocably shattered, replaced by the face of a man whose secrets had the power to destroy everything he built. When Paul entered the study, his groggy eyes widened at the sight of Karen sitting on the floor amid piles of damning documents. Karen, what is all this? Karen looked up, her expression hollow. The truth. Paul crouched beside her, sifting through the papers. His eyes caught on one document, a ledger meticulously detailing the embezzlement scheme Elizabeth had mentioned. The numbers were staggering, implicating not just Henry but several of his closest associates. This is worse than I thought, Paul muttered. This isn't just about Dad. If this gets out, it could ruin the entire family. Karen shook her head. The family's already ruined, Paul. We just didn't know it. Meanwhile, Robert had spent the morning pacing the backyard, his phone pressed to his ear. Yes, I understand, he barked into the receiver. No, I can't discuss the details right now, but this needs to be handled quietly. As he ended the call, Daniel stepped out from the kitchen, arms crossed. Who was that? None of your business, Robert snapped. Daniel's gaze darkened. Let me guess. One of your corporate buddies? Trying to figure out how to cover this up. Robert scoffed. You don't know what you're talking about. Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and sharp. I know exactly what I'm talking about. You're just like your father. Always looking out for yourself, no matter who gets hurt. Robert's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Karen appeared in the doorway. Both of you stop it. We have bigger problems. She held up the ledger and the photograph. This proves everything. Dad wasn't just embezzling. He was working with people who could destroy us if they're still out there. Robert's face paled. What do you mean, destroy us? Karen gestured to the ledger. These names, these are powerful people. Politicians, business leaders. If Dad kept these records, he must have had leverage on them. But if they find out we have this... Her voice trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. That afternoon, the siblings and Daniel gathered in the living room to decide their next move. The tension was palpable, each of them grappling with the enormity of what they'd uncovered. "We need to take this to the authorities," Karen said firmly. "No," Robert snapped. "Do you have any idea what kind of fallout that would bring? The media would tear us apart. The company would collapse. And let's not forget the legal consequences. We'd be dragged into court for years. So what do you suggest?" Paul countered. "We just bury it and pretend none of this ever happened?" Robert ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I'm saying we need to be smart about this. If we're going to expose Dad, we need to do it in a way that doesn't take us down with him." Daniel, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "This isn't about you or your family's reputation. This is about justice for my mother." Karen nodded. "He's right. We owe it to Elizabeth to do the right thing." Paul sighed. "But what is the right thing? This isn't just about Dad anymore. It's about the people in that ledger, the ones who still have power. If we go after them, they'll come after us." That night, Karen couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the kitchen, the photograph of Elizabeth and Henry lying on the table. The woman's sad eyes seemed to plead with her, begging her to uncover the truth. As Karen stared at the photograph, she noticed something she hadn't before. A faint mark in the corner of the image. She held it up to the light and saw a handwritten note on the back. "The cabin. 1983. Her heart raced. The cabin. She remembered visiting it as a child. A remote property her father had owned deep in the woods. He had always called it his retreat, a place to escape the pressures of work. Karen rushed to find Paul and Robert, who were still awake in the study. "I think I know where Dad kept the rest of the evidence," she said breathlessly. Robert frowned. "What are you talking about?" Karen handed him the photograph. "The cabin. It's the last piece of the puzzle. If Dad hid something, it's there." Paul nodded. "Then we need to go. First thing in the morning." The next day, the four of them, Karen, Paul, Robert, and Daniel, piled into the car and drove to the cabin. The journey was tense, each of them lost in their thoughts. As they turned onto the overgrown dirt road leading to the property, a sense of unease settled over them. The cabin was just as Karen remembered, small and unassuming, nestled among towering pine trees. But as they approached, something felt off. The door was slightly ajar, and the air inside was thick with dust and decay. "Be careful," Paul said as they stepped inside. They searched the cabin methodically, opening drawers and cabinets, checking under furniture, and tapping on walls for hidden compartments. In the bedroom, Karen found an old trunk. She opened it to reveal stacks of documents, photographs, and tapes. Her hands trembled as she sifted through them. "This is it," she whispered. "Everything Elizabeth mentioned. The proof." The group gathered around the trunk, their faces illuminated by the dim light of a single lamp. Karen pulled out a photograph that made her stomach drop. It was of Henry standing with a group of men, all of whom were listed in the ledger. "These are the people Dad was working with," Karen said. "They're the ones he protected by destroying Elizabeth." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And now we have the evidence to expose them." Robert shook his head. "Do you have any idea what you're saying? These people won't just sit back and let us ruin them. They'll fight back with everything they have." Paul sighed. "So what do we do? If we keep this quiet, we're no better than Dad. But if we expose it..." He didn't need to finish. They all knew the risks. As they packed up the evidence, a noise outside made them freeze. Karen's heart pounded as she crept to the window. In the distance, she saw the faint glow of headlights approaching. "Someone's coming," she whispered. Daniel moved quickly, closing the trunk and locking it. "We need to get out of here. Now!" The group scrambled to gather the documents. But as the car pulled up outside, it was clear they wouldn't make it in time. "Who is it?" Robert asked, his voice low. Karen peeked through the curtain. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the man stepping out of the car. It was one of the men from the photograph. Dad's old partner, Karen whispered. He's here. The chapter ends in breathless suspense, leaving the Browns to face the terrifying possibility that their father's secrets have put them in immediate danger. Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the man approach the cabin. She didn't need to see his face up close to know who he was. Frank Whitmore, her father's oldest business partner. His imposing figure moved with a deliberate confidence, and even in the dim light of the cabin's front porch, his sharp features carried the weight of a man who wasn't here by accident. She backed away from the window, her voice a hurried whisper. It's Frank Whitmore. He was Dad's partner. He's in the ledger. Paul's brow furrowed. Why is he here? How would he even know we're at the cabin? I don't know, Karen replied, her voice trembling. But we can't let him find this. She gestured to the trunk filled with evidence. Too late for that now, Robert muttered, his tone laced with panic. Daniel stood near the door, his jaw clenched. I'll talk to him. Paul grabbed his arm. Are you insane? This guy isn't here to chat. He's here to make sure we don't leave with anything that could destroy him. Then what do you suggest? Daniel shot back. We just wait for him to break in? Karen looked around the room, her mind racing. We need to hide the trunk. If he finds it, we're done. The siblings and Daniel worked quickly, moving the heavy trunk into a hollowed-out space beneath the floorboards of the bedroom. Paul threw an old rug over the spot, hoping it would be enough to conceal the hiding place. As they finished, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. Open up! Frank's deep voice boomed, his tone commanding. I know you're in there. Let's have a little chat. Karen swallowed hard and looked at her brothers. Paul nodded, his expression grim, and moved toward the door. As he opened it, Frank stood on the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the glare of his car's headlights. His sharp blue eyes scanned Paul with an unnerving intensity. Well, Frank said, his lips curling into a faint smirk. Looks like the Brown kids are having a little family reunion. Mind if I come in? Paul hesitated, but Karen stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. What do you want, Frank? Frank chuckled, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Straight to the point, just like your father. He and I always appreciated that about you, Karen. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension as Frank's eyes roamed the room, lingering briefly on each of them before settling on Daniel. And you must be Radford's boy, Frank said, his tone dripping with disdain. You've got your mother's stubbornness written all over your face. Daniel's fists clenched, but he remained silent. Frank turned back to Karen. I'll make this simple. I know what you found, and I know what you're thinking of doing with it. But let me warn you, it's not just your father's reputation on the line here. It's your entire family's future. Karen met his gaze, her anger flaring. Is that a threat? Frank's smirk widened. Call it friendly advice. Your father worked hard to protect all of you. He made sacrifices to ensure you'd have the life you enjoy today. But if you dig too deep, if you let those skeletons out of the closet, you'll lose everything he built. Paul stepped forward, his voice low and menacing. What sacrifices are you talking about, Frank? The embezzlement? Destroying Elizabeth Radford's life? What else did our father do to protect us? Frank's expression darkened. You're playing a dangerous game, son. You think you know what you're dealing with, but you don't. Your father didn't just steal money, he controlled people. People who don't take kindly to having their names dragged through the mud. Karen's voice broke the silence. People like you? Frank's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Frank began pacing, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. You think this is about justice, don't you? About righting some old wrong? Let me tell you something about justice. It doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't keep the lights on or put food on the table. Your father understood that. That's why he did what he did. Karen shook her head, her voice trembling with emotion. You're defending him? After everything he did? He ruined lives, Frank. He ruined Elizabeth Radford's life. Frank stopped pacing and fixed her with a cold stare. And what do you think happens if you expose him? You think the world will thank you? No, Karen. They'll tear your family apart. Your father might be gone, but his enemies aren't. And trust me, they'll come for you next. The tension in the room reached a boiling point as Frank's words hung in the air. Daniel finally stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. You can try to scare them all you want, he said, but I'm not walking away from this. My mother deserves justice, and I'll make sure she gets it. Even if it means taking you down. Frank chuckled, but there was no humor in his eyes. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But guts won't save you when the people in that ledger come knocking. Karen stepped forward, her voice firm. Get out, Frank. We're done listening to your threats. For a moment, Frank hesitated, as if considering his next move. Then he nodded, a faint smirk returning to his lips. Suit yourself, he said, turning toward the door. But don't say I didn't warn you. As he left, the sound of his car engine fading into the distance. The Browns and Daniel stood in the dimly lit cabin, their nerves frayed. Paul broke the silence. He knows we have the evidence. He's not going to let this go. Karen nodded, her mind racing. Then we need to act fast. We need to get this evidence somewhere safe before Frank, or anyone else, comes back. Robert, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. And then what? You want to blow this whole thing wide open? You heard what he said, Karen. If we go after these people, they'll come after us. Karen met his gaze. Maybe, but if we don't do something, we're just as guilty as Dad. We can't let him get away with this. Not after everything he did to Elizabeth. The group spent the rest of the night packing up the evidence and devising a plan. Karen contacted a journalist she trusted, someone she knew would handle the story with care. But as the first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows, a sense of unease settled over them. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. In the distance, the faint sound of a car engine echoed through the woods. Someone's coming, Paul said, his voice tense. Karen's heart raced as she peeked out the window. 2 black SUVs were approaching, their headlights cutting through the morning mist. Get the evidence, Karen said, her voice urgent. We need to get out of here, now. As the SUVs drew closer, the Browns realized they weren't just fighting to uncover the truth. They were fighting to survive the storm it had unleashed. The sound of the SUVs tearing through the gravel road sent a jolt of fear through the group. Karen's hands trembled as she clutched the trunk's lid, her mind racing with possibilities. The evidence they had gathered, ledgers, photographs, and letters, was damning, and now they were being hunted for it. We need to move. Now, Karen hissed, her voice taut with urgency. Paul and Daniel quickly hefted the heavy trunk from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. Robert, his face pale, hovered near the window. His hand pressed against the glass as he watched the vehicles come to a stop just yards from the cabin. They're armed, Robert whispered, his voice tight. I saw one of them step out with a gun. Of course they're armed, Paul snapped. They're not here for a friendly chat. Karen grabbed the nearest bag, shoving as many of the documents inside as she could. We don't have time to argue. We need to get out the back. The group rushed to the rear door of the cabin, their movements frantic but deliberate. Karen led the way, gripping a flashlight as she pushed open the rickety door, its hinges groaning in protest. The dense forest loomed ahead, offering their only hope of escape. Stay close, Karen whispered. We need to stick together. The cold morning air bit at their faces as they slipped into the shadows of the trees. Behind them, the sound of car doors slamming and boots crunching against gravel signaled the arrival of their pursuers. Paul glanced over his shoulder, his breath visible in the crisp air. They're spreading out. They're going to search the cabin first. Daniel, carrying one end of the trunk, grimaced. That gives us a head start, but not much. Where are we even going? There's an old service road about a mile west, Karen said. If we can get there, we might be able to flag someone down. Robert, who had been silent for most of the escape, finally spoke. And if they catch us? Karen stopped abruptly, her gaze fierce. They won't. Keep moving. As they weaved through the forest, the group moved as quietly as they could, the weight of the trunk slowing their pace. The sounds of the men searching the cabin echoed faintly through the trees, followed by muffled voices. "They found the cabin empty," Daniel muttered. "It's only a matter of time before they start looking out here." "Let them," Paul said, his tone defiant. "We're not going to let them scare us into giving this up." Karen shot him a warning glance. "This isn't just about courage, Paul. We need to be smart. If we don't make it out with this evidence, it's all over." As they pressed on, the tension among them grew. Robert stumbled over a tree root, nearly dropping the bag of documents he carried. "Do you have to make so much noise?" Paul hissed. "Do you have to keep acting like you're in charge?" Robert shot back. Karen spun around, her voice low but firm. "Enough. This isn't the time for your petty arguments. We need to work together if we're going to get out of this." The sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush sent a ripple of panic through the group. Karen motioned for everyone to stop and crouch behind a cluster of bushes. Through the branches, they saw two men moving methodically through the forest, flashlights sweeping the ground. Their voices carried in the still air. "They couldn't have gotten far," one of the men said. "The trunk's too heavy to move fast." Karen's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Daniel, who held the trunk's other handle. His face was pale, but his grip was steady. Paul leaned closer to Karen, his voice barely audible. "What do we do?" Karen's mind raced. "We wait until they move past us. Then we keep heading west. Stay low and stay quiet." The group held their breath as the men drew closer, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. For a moment, it seemed as though the beam would land directly on their hiding spot. But then, the men turned and headed deeper into the woods, their voices fading. Karen exhaled slowly. "Let's go." The group pressed on, their movements slower and more cautious. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf sent their nerves on edge. The forest, which had once seemed like their refuge, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows. As they approached the service road, Karen's flashlight caught something metallic glinting in the distance. A car. Relief washed over her as she whispered, "There's someone there." But as they drew closer, the relief turned to dread. The car was empty, its doors wide open. Nearby, a small campfire smoldered, but no one was in sight. "This isn't good," Paul said, his voice low. Karen scanned the area, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Stay close. Don't let your guard down." The sound of a twig snapping behind them sent the group whirling around. Standing just a few feet away was Frank Whitmore, his expression cold and calculating. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Frank said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really thought you could outrun me?" Paul stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Back off, Frank. You're not getting your hands on this evidence." Frank smirked. "I don't need to get my hands on it. All I need is to make sure you don't live long enough to use it." Karen's blood ran cold as she realized the implication. Frank wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to silence them for good. Before Frank could take another step, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The group turned to see flashing blue and red lights approaching from the direction of the service road. Frank's expression faltered for the first time. "You called the cops?" Karen met his gaze, her voice steady. "No, but it looks like someone else did." As the police vehicles pulled up, officers emerged with their weapons drawn. Frank hesitated, then raised his hands in surrender. An officer approached the group, his stern gaze shifting between them. "What's going on here?" Karen took a deep breath and stepped forward. "We have evidence of criminal activity. And she pointed to Frank, is trying to cover it up." In the chaos that followed, the Browns handed over the trunk and the documents to the authorities. Frank was taken into custody, though he maintained his cold composure. His parting words a chilling reminder. This isn't over. As the sun rose over the forest, the group stood together, their relief tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from finished. They had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? Karen turned to her siblings, her voice heavy with resolve. "We've done our part. Now it's up to the authorities to bring these people to justice." Daniel nodded, though his expression remained somber. "This won't bring my mother back, but maybe it'll stop them from hurting anyone else." As they made their way back to the cabin, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that their father's secrets still had more to reveal. The evidence might have been handed over, but the scars it left behind would take much longer to heal. The Browns had survived the night, but their journey was far from over. The drive back from the forest was oppressively silent, each member of the group consumed by the weight of the night's events. The police had taken Frank Whitmore into custody, but his chilling words, "This isn't over," echoed in Karen's mind. They had handed over the evidence, yet the cost of their actions felt insurmountable. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the trees blurred past. Karen glanced at him, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Daniel didn't turn to her. "I should feel relief, shouldn't I? But all I feel is anger. Anger that it took this long for someone to listen. Anger that my mother had to suffer for something she couldn't control." Karen swallowed the lump in her throat. "We listen, Daniel, and we'll make sure the truth comes out. That's what matters now." Paul, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward. "Do you think the cops will actually do anything with the evidence? Or will this just get buried like everything else?" Robert, seated beside Paul, snorted. "What do you think? People like Frank Whitmore have connections everywhere. He'll be out on bail by the end of the day." Karen shot him a glare through the rearview mirror. "Don't start, Robert. We've done everything we could. The rest is out of our hands." When they arrived back at the estate, the house felt colder, more ominous than ever. The shadows cast by the mid-morning sun seemed to stretch longer, as if the home itself was reluctant to welcome them back. Karen walked into the living room and immediately noticed something was off. The curtains, which she had left drawn, were open, and a faint smell of cigar smoke lingered in the air. Paul stepped in behind her, his face darkening. "Someone's been here." Karen nodded, her instincts on high alert. "Check the rest of the house." As Paul and Daniel began searching the rooms, Karen and Robert remained in the living room. Robert leaned against the fireplace, his expression grim. "This isn't going to end, you know? We've stirred up a hornet's nest." Karen crossed her arms. "You're right. It's not over. But we can't let fear stop us from doing what's right." Robert scoffed. "And what's right, Karen? Destroying our father's legacy? Dragging this family's name through the mud?" Karen's voice hardened. "Our father destroyed his own legacy. We're just uncovering the truth. And if you can't see that, maybe you should have stayed out of it." Before Robert could respond, Paul called out from upstairs. "You need to see this." Karen and Robert rushed upstairs to find Paul standing in their father's old bedroom, his face pale. He pointed to the bed, where a single envelope rested on the pillow. Karen's heart sank as she picked it up. The envelope was addressed simply to the Browns. She opened it carefully, her hands shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "You've opened a door you can't close. Walk away or face the consequences. This is your only warning." Karen stared at the note, her blood running cold. "They were here, while we were at the cabin." Paul clenched his fists. "They're trying to scare us. They think we'll back down." Robert shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we should." Karen turned to him, her eyes blazing. "No, we've come too far. We're not backing down now." That evening, the Browns gathered in the living room to discuss their next move. Daniel sat with them, his presence now an unspoken reminder of why they couldn't give up. "We need to release the evidence to the press," Karen said. "It's the only way to make sure the truth gets out." Paul nodded. "Agreed. If we go public, Frank and his people won't be able to silence us without drawing attention." Robert frowned. "And what happens when they come after us anyway? You think a few reporters will stop them? They've already broken into our house. For God's sake." Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Your father spent years hiding the truth. Don't make the same mistake he did. If we let fear control us, they win." Karen looked at Robert. "He's right. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about Elizabeth. It's about everyone Dad hurt. We have to do this." The next morning, Karen contacted a trusted journalist, a woman named Rachel Morgan who had built her career exposing corruption. Rachel agreed to meet them at a nearby diner to discuss the evidence. When Karen, Paul, and Daniel arrived at the diner, Rachel was already waiting, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She greeted them with a firm handshake and wasted no time getting to the point. "I read your email," Rachel said. "If what you're saying is true, this could be the story of the year. But I need to see the evidence before I commit to anything." Karen handed over a USB drive containing scanned copies of the ledgers, photographs, and letters. Rachel plugged it into her laptop and began scrolling through the files, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. "This is damning," Rachel said. "If we publish this, it'll blow the lid off decades of corruption." Karen nodded. "That's the idea." Rachel hesitated. "But you need to understand something. Once this goes public, you'll be targets. People like Frank Whitmore don't go down without a fight. Are you prepared for that?" Karen exchanged a glance with Paul and Daniel before nodding. "We are." The following day, the story broke. Headlines across major news outlets detailed the Brown family's revelations. Embezzlement, corruption, and the decades-long cover-up orchestrated by Henry Brown and his associates. The fallout was immediate. Frank Whitmore's arrest was splashed across every news channel, and his powerful connections were quickly exposed. Several of the men listed in the ledger were named in the investigation, their reputations crumbling under the weight of the evidence. But the Browns weren't spared. Reporters swarmed their estate, demanding interviews and hurling accusations. Old family secrets resurfaced, and their once sterling name became a symbol of scandal. That evening, Karen sat alone in the study, staring at the family portrait on the wall. The faces in the picture seemed like strangers now, shadows of a life that no longer existed. Paul entered the room, his expression tired but resolute. "You okay?" Karen shrugged. "I don't know. We did the right thing, but it doesn't feel like a victory." Paul nodded. "Because it's not. Not yet. But we've taken the first step." Karen looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and hope. "Do you think we'll ever be able to move on from this?" Paul sighed. "Maybe, but only if we stick together." As the Browns prepared for the storm that lay ahead, they couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The truth had been unleashed, but its consequences were far from over. The days following the story's release were a whirlwind of chaos. The Brown family estate became a battleground for reporters, lawyers, and angry protesters who felt betrayed by Henry Brown's legacy. The scandal, now dubbed the Brown Files, dominated headlines across the country. Karen spent most of her days in the study, answering calls from the journalist Rachel Morgan, who continued to dig deeper into the story. Paul worked tirelessly to keep the family afloat, dealing with the barrage of legal threats pouring in from every direction. Robert, however, withdrew completely. He rarely left his room, and when he did, his eyes carried the look of a man burdened by secrets. Karen had tried to talk to him, but he pushed her away, muttering only that they had gone too far. One quiet evening, Karen sat alone in the study, poring over the remaining documents they hadn't handed over to the authorities. The family home, once warm and full of life, now felt cold and hollow. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the curtains seemed amplified in the silence. As Karen flipped through a bundle of old letters, one envelope caught her eye. It was sealed and marked with a date, March 1983. She froze. This was 2 months before the infamous Radford meeting noted in her father's calendar. Carefully, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her heart stopped as she read the words. "Henry, I know about the boy. You think you've hidden him from everyone. But secrets like this don't stay buried forever. If you want my silence, you'll give me what I've asked for. This is your last chance." Elizabeth, Karen's mind raced. The boy? What boy? She read the letter again, her stomach twisting with unease. Paul entered the study, a mug of coffee in his hand. "You've been in here all day. You should take a break." Karen looked up at him, the letter trembling in her hands. "Paul, I think there's more to this than we realized." Paul frowned, setting the mug down. "What do you mean?" Karen handed him the letter. "Read this." As Paul scanned the page, His expression shifted from confusion to shock. What boy? Is she talking about Daniel? Karen shook her head. I don't think so. Elizabeth never mentioned a second child. But what if there was someone else? Someone Dad was hiding from all of us? The next morning, Karen, Paul, and Daniel gathered in the study to piece together the puzzle. Robert, as usual, refused to join them, locking himself in his room. Karen spread out the remaining documents on the desk. If Elizabeth knew about another child, there has to be something here that confirms it. Daniel, flipping through an old ledger, froze when he found a line item labeled Private Account. HB. The account showed a series of monthly payments to a woman named Margaret Hill. Who's Margaret Hill? Daniel asked. Paul leaned over to look at the page. I've never heard that name before. Karen frowned, the name tugging at something in the back of her mind. Wait a second. She grabbed the family photo album from the bookshelf and flipped through the pages. There it was. A photograph of Henry at a charity event, standing beside a woman with dark hair and striking features. The caption beneath the photo read, Henry Brown with Margaret Hill, 1981. Karen's voice was barely above a whisper. She's connected to him. And those payments. They didn't stop until 1983. Daniel's eyes narrowed. That's the same year my mother was fired. The same year everything fell apart. Paul exhaled slowly. It can't be a coincidence. Margaret Hill and Elizabeth Radford are connected somehow. And if Elizabeth knew about the payments, Karen finished the thought. Then Margaret must have been part of the reason Dad wanted to silence her. Karen spent the next several hours digging into public records for any trace of Margaret Hill. Eventually, she found a single obituary, dated 1983. Margaret had died in a car accident just 3 months after Elizabeth was fired. But it wasn't the obituary that caught Karen's attention. It was the name listed as Margaret's next of kin. Benjamin Hill, age 6. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The boy. She had a son. Paul, sitting across from her, leaned forward. You think he's Dad's? Karen nodded slowly. It fits. The payments, the timing, Elizabeth's letter. Margaret must have been involved with Dad. And when she died, Elizabeth found out about the boy. That's why she threatened him. Daniel, who had been pacing the room, stopped abruptly. So what happened to the boy? If he was Dad's, why didn't he come forward after Margaret died? Karen's voice was quiet. Maybe Dad made sure he couldn't. As night fell, Karen decided to confront Robert. She couldn't ignore his odd behavior any longer. She knocked on his door, and when there was no answer, she pushed it open. Robert was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at an old photograph in his hands. Karen recognized it instantly. It was a picture of their father and Margaret Hill. How long have you known? Karen asked, her voice steady but sharp. Robert didn't look up. I found out a few years ago. I was going through Dad's files after he died and found a letter from Margaret. She begged him to acknowledge Benjamin. She said she didn't care about the money. She just wanted her son to know his father. Karen's stomach turned. Why didn't you tell us? Robert finally looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt. Because I was ashamed. Ashamed of what Dad did. And ashamed of myself for not doing anything about it. Karen stepped closer. Robert, do you know what happened to Benjamin? Robert hesitated, then nodded. He was put into the foster system after Margaret died. Dad didn't want to take responsibility, so he made sure Benjamin disappeared. Karen's hands clenched into fists. He abandoned his own child, just like he destroyed Elizabeth's life. The following morning, Karen and Paul tracked down Benjamin Hill. He was now a grown man, living under a different name in a small town outside Charleston. When they found him, he was working as a mechanic at a local garage. Benjamin was tall and broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes that reminded Karen of their father. As she approached him, she felt a lump form in her throat. Benjamin, she said hesitantly. He looked up, wiping grease from his hands. Yeah? Who's asking? Karen took a deep breath. My name is Karen Brown. I think we're related. The conversation that followed was emotional and raw. Benjamin had spent his entire life believing he was unwanted, discarded by a man who had the power to change his fate but chose not to. When Karen showed him the evidence they had uncovered, tears filled his eyes. All these years, I thought I didn't matter, that my mother's death was just bad luck. But now I see it was all part of his plan. Paul placed a hand on Benjamin's shoulder. You matter, and we're going to make sure the world knows the truth. In the days that followed, the Browns worked tirelessly to bring Benjamin's story to light. Rachel Morgan published a follow-up article, revealing Henry Brown's abandonment of his illegitimate son and the lengths he went to in order to keep it a secret. The public backlash was swift and severe. Henry's legacy was irreparably tarnished, but for the first time, the Browns felt a sense of closure. As the family gathered for dinner one evening, Karen looked around the table. For all the pain and betrayal they had endured, they had survived together. Benjamin raised his glass. To my mother, and to the truth. The others joined in, their glasses clinking softly in the dim light. For the first time in years, the Browns felt a glimmer of hope. Their father's lies had fractured their family, but the truth had brought them back together. And in that moment, they realized that their true legacy wasn't the name Henry Brown had built. It was the strength they had found in each other.